peace, at rest, belly up, beyond the grave, beyond the veil, big sleeps, bites the dust, kicks the bucket, and sleeping with the fishes. At some point, somebody's going to say this, or some other derivative of these sayings to illustrate one thing about you. You're dead. So why am I telling you this? After all, most of us probably don't want to die, which is a good thing, and if you do, please immediately stop watching this video and contact the suicide helpline as soon as possible. But if you're like the majority of people, which I really hope you are, you probably want to keep on living. So why am I telling you about this? Well, even though it's a really hard conversation to have, it is very, 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 very important that you actually still have that conversation. Especially if you're in your later years, because there's a lot of information your family is going to need from you. For instance, let's say you have a couple of things. Obviously, those things are not going to come over with you, so people need to know where you want those things to go. If you don't specify, it can be a bit of a complication afterwards. But frankly, in my personal opinion, that's one of the least of the major things you need to discuss. So I'm going to go over each thing and explain why it's so important that your family knows before your unfortunate time finally comes. The first thing is, let's say that you were rendered unconscious during your last time on this earth. Let's say perhaps it's some sort of brain condition. Now, in this hypothetical scenario, we could either hook you up to machines or put drugs in you that will keep you alive a little bit longer, but would make your last few days much more sufferable, as opposed to just letting you pass away a few days earlier. Now, if you don't let your family know ahead of time, then they're going to sit there extremely stressed because they won't know what you would have wanted them to do, because you're not really there to answer. You're unconscious. So they're going to sit there extremely stressed out because they don't know whether to just let you pass or try to prolong your life a little bit. So that's one of the major things that your family needs to know if you ever rendered unconscious, and it's probably going to be your last few days, if you want them just to let you pass or if you want them to prolong your life, possibly increasing your suffering. And that's one of the things that they need to know. One thing that people will say is, oh, well, my children or my wife or my husband would know. And that's a fair point, but I would still encourage you to ask them to see if they would actually be able to get it right. And keep in mind, even if they are able to get it right, dead, spot on, exactly what you would want, they're not sure of that. There's no way of them saying, hey, did I get it right? To be sure, that's exactly what you would have wanted. In which case, they might be extremely uncertain and bothered by that for a really long time because you never actually told them exactly what you would have wanted. So they do need to know that. Another thing that they need to know is perhaps funeral arrangements. If they don't know what you would want, then there's a good chance that they're going to go extremely overboard with things that you probably wouldn't have even wanted, especially if you knew that they would cause an extreme financial strain on your family. One thing that happens oftentimes is that people don't need a particularly expensive casket. I know a lot of people who personally, they just don't need an expensive casket just because as far as they know, they're really not going to need anything other than somewhere to be put in. So long as they're being treated respectfully, they really don't care. And perhaps this is you. But if you don't tell your family, then they might go out of their way, because some of these caskets are extremely expensive. Some of these are just wood, and those alone are unbelievably expensive. But they get even more expensive because there are some with Bluetooth, TVs, Wi-Fi, a lot of things that, unless you come back to life, you're probably not going to use them. And if you're the kind of person that thinks, well, I'm probably not going to use them, so I really don't want my family to pay for it, then you definitely need to tell them, because more often than not, families, because they feel that their loved one needs to have the best because they really loved them while they were in life, should get them the best coffin, even if you personally do not care if it's an extremely expensive coffin, so long as it's done respectfully. Now, I'm going to branch off of the funeral thing to give some information that I think is very important for families to have when they're planning a funeral. One thing I'll see a lot of families do is that they'll embalm the body. Now, if you have some sort of principle or religious reason for doing that, by all means do it. But I will give you some information. I've seen that if a lot of people had this information, they wouldn't have bothered embalming the body. The first thing is that one misconception a lot of people have is that it's not safe to have the body for an open casket funeral unless it's embalmed. Now, from the research I've done, which of course, as always, will be left down in the description below if you want to look at it yourself, for the most part, you should be fine, unless there was some sort of disease or a condition that the body was put through or that the person was put through that actually caused their death. that's extremely dangerous. Other than those kinds of conditions, for the most part, so long as you refrigerate the body until the funeral, and the funeral is pretty close to the actual time of death, most part, you're usually okay. Obviously, ask the doctor or whoever saw him deceased what the best, if that's a possible option. Most of the time it is. I just thought it was worth noting because a lot of people will go ahead and embalm it because they think it's necessary for an open casket or open cask funeral when it really isn't. Another thing is I just want to go over the basic process just so you know what actually goes on. Of course, again, a link will be down in the description that will give it to you in far more detail. So if you're actually considering doing an embalming for a loved one, I encourage you to look at it. I'm just going to go over it very, very briefly. Essentially, all they do is glue the eyes shut, wire the mouth closed. They fill the body with a formaldehyde-based chemical, and that's essentially it. Obviously, there's a fair bit more to it. That's just a very quick, brief summary of it. I just figured I'd tell you just so you know. And the other thing is that there are other options beyond just the embalming, the burying, and the cremation. Just so that you know, there are a few other unique options. I've heard people that there's a service fairly expensive, so maybe not for you, but you can actually have your loved one put into a pod with a tree seed, and then the tree will grow from the nutrients of the body, and then it's sentimental because it's like from his end comes a new life. Now, whether you want to do that or not, that's up to you. There's a few other options that, of course, I will also leave in the description below. I just wanted to make you aware of them in case you wanted to look for other options. If you wanted my personal recommendation as to how you might want to have your funeral, my recommendation would be what's called a natural burial. It's just when the body's wrapped in a natural sheet, it's buried by itself, no casket, no chemical, or no added unnecessary chemicals, and then it just naturally decomposes. Because it's still honorable for the body, it's still respectful for the person who previously lived, it's extremely affordable, and it's no extra harm to the environment that you're buried in. So for that reason, I would generally recommend it. Obviously, other factors might affect that decision. For instance, if the person had some sort of problem that might not make it a good idea to bury him or her, perhaps you wanted to move him or her to a different country, those kind of things would obviously affect the decision, but in general, that'd be my personal recommendation. But again, however you feel is best for yourself, just make sure that you tell your family, especially because, look, the fact of the matter is, as hard as it may be to accept, you never really know when it's going to happen. So it might even be a good idea, even if you're young and as far as you can tell healthy, to still make sure somebody knows how you would want it to happen, because, again, you never really know when it's going to happen. Now, I really hope that you do have a long and prosperous life, but realistically, we do need to accept that that is technically a possibility, and if we don't, we can end up, especially our families, putting them through a lot of suffering and uncertainty, because if they make a decision and you never told them, whatever decision they made, they'll be extremely unsure for the rest of the time because you never told them what you would have preferred. So they're essentially just guessing and possibly always worried that they made the wrong guess. Now, I don't know what kind of videos you watch on YouTube, but I'm willing to guess that this is probably one of the hardest ones to watch, if not the hardest one to watch, especially if you're one of the people who are in their later years, because, yeah, death is not something we're particularly fond of talking about, understandably. But like I said at the beginning of the video, even if you're young and healthy, something could happen to you. Now, I'm not saying something will happen to you, and I really hope I haven't made you paranoid that something will happen to you. I'm just saying that in case something happens to you, it's best that you have had that conversation, regardless of your age. And yeah, it's probably going to be a long conversation, and it's okay if it's a long conversation, so long as you have the conversation. One last thing before I go. Obviously, I don't know most, if anybody, who actually watches my videos, but if you guys have lost anybody, my condolences. I hope you're able to mourn, but still move on. Well, guys, that's it for this video. I hope to catch you guys the Sunday after next. And until then, hear nothing and listen to all. Bye, guys.